in the meantime, we have a second, speaker who is a Charles Knight. And if Charles, if you are around, I think you should just jump in.
Oh, thank you, Carlos. And thank you, Craig, for suggesting that I address this issue of how to engage men around their own interests. And
welcome.
I took a little piece of my introduction and put it in the chat room. I thought it important to say a few words about my perspective, how I come to this stuff, and just a little bit more about myself. So I urge you to check that out if you didn't get a chance to read that. But I'll just jump right in to my premises and how I think about this. I believe there is what I would call a non-trivial minority of males who reject the patriarchal masculine gender identity and its associated roles. These men reject employing the instruments of violence and other tools of domination over others, both male and female. My thought has been that when these men are organized into a self-confident identity and have alignment with other gender identity groupings which share anti-violence interests, we will be much closer to achieving a political majority which can make very significant social and economic change. Now, what brought me to suggest this topic is that recently I have felt growing frustration rising from my observation that despite what I see as an explosion during the last 20 years of non-binary gender awareness, so few of us who are male identified have chosen to make it a priority to join with women in active political struggle against the structures of patriarchal domination. I think about several Boston area groups of men I've been part of. These have usually had explicit feminist agendas, including in one case defining its subject matter explicitly as dismantling patriarchy. My experience of these groups have been great as far as they go. They have had talented discussion leaders. We are encouraged to engage with our own roles in patriarchy and how we may unconsciously perpetuate its structures and effects. I've been very impressed by how conscious, kind, and intellectually committed the other men have been. And yet, I find myself thinking, why don't we take the next step of action? Here, I don't really imagine taking really big steps initially, just the obvious, like contacting feminist organizations and asking what an organized group of men with feminist consciousness could do to further their agendas. In other words, showing up. I have speculated about why these men are not yet inclined to be more active together. One thought I have is that we understand intellectually the oppressions of patriarchy, but we approach it with that conflicted combination of guilt and charitable impulse, which manifests as, I should do something for my sisters. In my opinion, this gets us only a short way towards what needs to happen. So, questions I have. What if we organized ourselves in some significant part, but not exclusively, around the anger and outrage that the reproduction of patriarchy typically involves the repeated shaming of and the use of intimidating violence against boys, some of whom are repulsed by that violence and choose not to learn the methods of domination over others? What if we organize ourselves around the revulsion of many boys to the male rituals revolving around warfare, around resisting the domination of men over men and women in the workplace, around a program of universal social benefits for people of all gender, racial, and other identities, a program that includes, for instance, universal child care and paid family leave. This is what I mean by engaging men through self-interest. It is posited on an analysis that patriarchy does not really serve the interests of all or even most who are male identified. Rather, patriarchy principally serves a relative few who dominate an unjust class structure. As a prop for this presentation, I thought of this, the respiratory mask. My interest is a collective interest in not spreading the virus. That's why I wear a mask when I go out. Similarly, my interest is a collective interest in ending the reproduction of violence and domination. And I thought of one final question, given that today is International Day of Action for Women's Health, May 28. Do men have an immediate and strong interest in women having healthy lives? Can men be mobilized to make women's health initiatives a priority in their lives? I think that's possible, and I look forward to comments and whatever. Help me understand why it's so difficult to get men active in this regard.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you. And Ross, you have the, I think there are questions.
There have not been any questions that came up on the chat. So it's kind of we're a small enough group that I think we can manage just having a dialogue, people's initial reactions or questions, kind of as a free-for-all.
I have a question. Charles, I think the title was related to self-interest. And when I read the email with that subject line, I sort of thought, if you align somebody's self-interest, their desired outcomes with the greater good, then you automatically get good outcomes. Is that what you're saying? Is that your question, how to align men's self-interest, whatever that might be at the time, with the greater good of less violence, better health, and more respect towards women? Is that how I have to understand that? Like this, the self-interest part is a little bit unclear.
I would respond, Ronnie, that I feel the notion of the self is a particularly sort of American obsession. I think we are social creatures, and our self-interest is automatically aligned with others in our lives. And I'll respond with something I've been thinking about recently. I took part in a meeting that was actually at Craig's house last fall in support of the women's health, Our Bodies Ourselves Today, a new initiative of Our Bodies of Ourselves collective. And during that, I had this realization that I've been feeling, and I think it has a lot to do with my age. I'm in my 70s. I feel very, very connected to the health of my 50-plus year partner, a woman, Susan, and I feel like our health interests are very unified, and particularly in the COVID crisis, in which we've been at home together now for 2 months, we are dealing with this pretty much as one. Occasionally we have a brief argument about what restrictions, how safe we need to be, whatever, but we work it through. It's pretty easy to analyze that our interests are one. And in terms of our bodies, ourselves, and its future, I was thinking during this meeting, and I talked to some other people, that, yeah, our bodies, ourselves, you know, could, especially an online version, could have something for men about their interest in their partner's health, and that's not, you know, it's not a women's issue exclusively. It's all about our collective interest, and it's not even a partner's interest. It's a broader interest. So,
thanks for that. Makes sense. So I understand this better. Maybe what I can offer here is the outside view from the non-American, looking into America, and what's the word? Shocked about the American health system from Europe, Australia. People go bankrupt because they have to go to the hospital. And I think that the COVID crisis has highlighted all the weak spots. You know, health insurance is connected to your work, and then you lose your job in a pandemic. That's not a good thing at all, and all these things. So I think that it's definitely not a female problem. I think it's like the whole society needs to sort of step up and fix a few things, in my opinion. National health system seems to be back to front. It seems to be designed towards profit rather than helping people. I'm not an expert, but that's what it looks like. And also our Western society in America is no exception there. It's all about self. It's all about me. In other societies, it's more about, like, you live in Tokyo for a while, you understand that people think about the greater good first before they think about themselves. Now over here, it's more, I think about myself before the group. So, and I think that what you're saying is, by looking after ourselves, we automatically look after everybody else, and you know, it's and not being so selfish, or helping others, not being so selfish, in turn helps us as well. It's a job of a storyteller. It's a job of people enthuse other people. It's not about facts. It's about, you know, I would say that in that context, Hollywood can probably evoke a better, bigger change in the general consciousness than you know, preaching something. So the idea is not new. And I think it's very interesting. And I think COVID brings out a lot of very horrible things, but also the opportunity to fix them. And in my life, people came closer, are more open. They feel so vulnerable on a daily basis, and that vulnerability opens them up to be more human. And I've had like people who I was fighting with for a while, the lawyer of one of my investors, who was always really toxic, called me one day and was just a man and was just nice and apologized for being an asshole. And like, well, like, what does that happened because of COVID? So it's an opportunity to exploit the general vulnerability that everybody feels towards something that combines us. My 2 cents.
And if I could jump in for a quick second, I also would like to add from that. So as I hear that discussion, I've had the opportunity to work with Russ for the last couple of months, gain his tutelage. And one of the underlying questions I have as I come into this work, I come from a field where I've done a lot of, you know, mentoring, fatherhood work, re-entry, and things like that. And I see where this work permeates into all those different lanes. When you ask that question, how come we can't get men to mobilize under this one theme, this one concept, this one whatever that thing is? I think it's often because we take the approach that we can always have a cookie cutter effect and think we can apply that to all communities and all situations. So when I hear your description, you talk about, you know, patriarchal views and things like that. I look at my community where I came from. Many of us didn't even know who our fathers were. So it wasn't always so much a patriarchal view that we were gaining. It was that confusion, that knowledge of not knowing, as was that abandonment, I think, was the prevailing word versus, dominance, I think was the word you used. It was abandonment for us. So what is the approach for that particular community?
Mm-hmm.
Is it still fair to the work if we're achieving the same results? However, that particular buzzword phrase is not the prevailing theme. Maybe it is fatherhood. Maybe it is whatever, you're touching that particular community that still has the same effect.
I want to chime in too. I think, Bonnie, you raised a good point around the U.S. Self-indulgent, self-centered, self-serving kind of, that's our culture, right? And how it's different than places like Japan. I know that's not your words, that's mine. I'm owning it. I'm a U.S. citizen. I know how self-serving our culture is. And yet, in a culture like Japan, they don't have a much better rate than we do of engaging men in this kind of work. And
worse in some respects, right?
I think, thanks, Ward. I think one of the things that emerges for me is around this whole conversation is self-interest has at least two meanings for us. One is the material self-interest, and the other is the meaning self-interest. So I have material self-interest, like being able to drive while white, that quite frankly, I don't know how to give up, and I don't know how, I'm not convinced even in my own self that I want to give it up. I like being able to drive and have a police officer roll up behind me and not feel the tension in my body because there's a cop riding behind. I like having that. Deeply, deeply like having that. So there's a material self-interest, but there's also a meaningful self-interest around my meaning making and how I understand myself as a human being who happens to be white. And in that moment, in this moment, talking about driving while white, those two self-interests are in conflict. And how do I maneuver through this one material self-interest that I really get benefit and privilege, that really benefits me, that is really in my self-interest to maintain, versus this other self-interest that's about meaning making, that means I have to give up something that sometimes the meaning making self-interest trumps, that's probably not the best choice of word, sorry, trumps my material self-interest. But sometimes it doesn't. And so I think in terms of this whole notion of using self-interest as a motivation for male engagement, it's really complex and nuanced. What I also find interesting is I don't hear as much of the conversation of self-interest as a motivator in working with white folks around anti-racism as I do in this conversation with men. In some ally work, there's a conversation about mutual interests and how my interests are mutually beneficial to Black and brown folks. But even that is more old school. It's not as much in the current anti-racism work. That is not as much a part of the conversation. In anti-racist work around building, ally building, and I think Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, is a great model of how they're being able to mobilize white folks with some progress in terms of numbers. There seems to be much more landing on compassion as the motivating factor rather than self-interest. Not that it's mutually exclusive. That's another false binary that I don't want to reinforce. But I think in terms of this notion of how can we get potential allies to act like allies, looking at some of the things like Showing Up for Racial Justice, looking at some of the work of back in the day, the gay liberation movement, and how they were able to effectively organize heterosexuals, and to this day in some of the two-thirds world, might be really powerful in us looking at what are the lessons learned and how do we apply that in the U.S. context in mobilizing men and boys.
Can I just ask a question there, Russ? The way you describe this, I have this privilege and I have to give that up for others to have the same. So to me, that brings up a comparison to my resistance to being wealthy. I always had the feeling that being wealthy is being bad. I grew up in a socialist household, and to me, rich people were evil people. and in order to make the world more equal, I had to come down, right? And then I sort of, one day I met somebody who told me, hey, Bonnie, money is just an instrument and amplifies who you already are. If you're good, it makes you, gives you more chance to do good in the world. And if you're a dickhead, then you can be a bigger dickhead. So, and that sort of empowered me to say, okay, money is not a bad thing. Like, the more money I have, the more money I make. And if I make it ethically, I can do more good in the world, right? So rather than bringing everybody down, bring everybody up. So why should not everybody drive what you're saying, the white privilege feeling of driving over here? You don't have to be scared when the police, and by the way, I am scared shitless when the US police officer approaches my car, because they're scary people. But I cannot imagine the same experience being black. Must be horrible. But why should not everybody feel that privilege? Why shouldn't everybody, rather than me having to give it up? No, it's fine. It's good. I feel good. I feel good in this situation, and everybody else should as well. It's like that idea of scarciness. Is that the word? There's enough to go around for everybody. It doesn't have to be. Like, I don't think I have to give it up in order for other people to have it as well.
Oswaldo, you raised a hand?
Yes, I want to thank Charles for his introduction in the chat. I think the way that you share with us your vulnerability about your experience as a boy, and how that informs how you engage in this struggle, and your relationship and commitment to support women's rights. And it's really important, and yeah, thank you for that, for showing that vulnerability. And I found it very powerful, and actually I think I can connect that with your question about how we can make men more attuned to this work. I think the more that we can present ourselves from that, with that approach that the way that you present to yourself, it's a way to perhaps activate that part of men's vulnerability that are very, very closed down because of socialization and patriarchy. That's one thing that I want to say. And the second is about men's self-interest. I think when you all were reflecting about that, it came to my mind the work of men like MLK, Martin Luther King, reflecting about the interwoven of the interconnectedness of all of us. Not only him, many people, men and women, wise people who have been reflecting about how we are all interconnected. So the idea of self-interest comes from an understanding of reality that is quite problematic. I mean, the idea of separation, that we are really separated when from a perhaps spiritual perspective, we are all one. And come to my mind also the term that I heard from Thich Nhat Hanh about interbeing, that we are very the same logic. And so when we shift the perspective, the concept of selfhood, it's quite different. And unfortunately, the norms that we read, the patriarchal norms, are about this. It reinforces separation. It starts from separating each other and being in competition and looking for my own, even myself, my family, my group, my race. So it's about changing that shifting that mentality that prevails in the world.
Thanks, Oswaldo. This is Craig. I love the idea that we're all connected. And at the same time, there's an interesting self-interest in the sense of being disconnected. That this is sort of the approach of talking about this man box framework with men in all contexts, that there's some limitation to that. There seems to be self-interest. It seems like we're appealing to a self-interest to speak about that, to say that there's a bigger world. to connect with others in a relational way, in a less competitive way, in a way that there's a way to be outside this box successfully, even though it's painful to venture there because you become a target. In that way that, Charles, you're remembering, is that if you're a boy who remains vulnerable and kind, become a target of the boys who are against that. And that how do we be more protective about the boys who wish to remain and who are remaining kind and vulnerable? And that's sort of part of what Bonnie, you're saying is, how do we protect, how do we allow and permit the boys to remain whole and human in these ways? And the Occult to Men framework, as was in the earlier days, about speaking about a box that you have to be in and you self-police, you're speaking about self-interest. This is a self-interest conversation in some respects. And that's why I think it's used. It gives a way to have a conversation about this that can be personally engaged, to promote we should be relational, and we want to celebrate relationality and celebrate nurturingness. And in a lot of respects, that goes to a kind of self-interest, to celebrate that. Why do we celebrate separateness and winning over someone else's losing is an interesting change of pace. And partly our movement is promoting nurturing is valuable and powerful. And connecting is valuable and powerful. To some degree, that is a self-interest argument. It's like caring and loving, and saying that it's okay to be a good dad, and that's not unmanly. This idea of manliness is at hand here. I heard the fellow talking about doing fatherhood work and connecting work and not knowing your dad, and the emptiness and the abandonment are all pains. And if we're not supposed to have pain, how do we live? How we can't share pain? This is part of the conversation. I think it's very much self-interest. That's what I want to share, is that actually we're using a self-interest argument in some of our work, at least. But I do think that there's other factors that leave us not mobilizing strongly. What did Rob Oken call his book? The largest movement you never heard of? The idea of, I grew up unlearning, to unlearn, to let go of, to take a back seat, to not be in the front. And now somebody called us that we need to step forward again in some way. So this is my 2 cents. Thanks for the conversation.
You've been very patient. You want to add your 2 cents or 5 cents or whatever it is?
Let me think.
I don't know if it's okay to offer some thoughts. I think one of the things to think about when we're exploring intrinsic motivation with men is, where are they in their journey and their cycle in order for them to be able to fully plumb that motivation and then fully understand that their need to connect, their hardwiring for biological connection, emotional connection, mental connection with other folks is critical and important, and more important than their rewards that they get from being dominant in those relationships. And until they're at a point where they can be open to a dialogue around what that dominance and the actions that they've taken to secure that dominance has cost them, that they're not really ready, right? So there's a readiness notion that I think we have to consider in that engagement process, because there's a lot of folks that quite frankly like the privilege, right? As Russ was talking about, it's one of those things that we don't want to let go of unless we start to count the cost of what that privilege has cost us, right? And in the study with abusive men that we did at the UW, the men's domestic abuse checkup, we developed a questionnaire that I think more than the motivational enhancement therapy that we were actually testing as a catalyst for change, that just asking them, what has your abusive behavior cost you, was the turning point, I think, for many of them. And I think we would have actually seen a higher engagement in help-seeking behavior with the control group had we not had that questionnaire given to everybody, because it was given to the control group and the experimental design group. So I just think we have to calculate that in too, right? Where are people? Where are they? Are they ready to consider the cost of male privilege and dominance as a criteria for surviving? And are they ready to make the transition from surviving to thriving?
So I'm aware of time, and we've got several people on the stack. We've got Joe and then Marshall, and then Charles wants to respond. I myself have to leave pretty close to 4:30.
Yeah, we can. Bruce, we can extend it for 5 more minutes before we wrap up.
So Joe and Marshall, we're gonna ask if you could, unlike the rest of us, try and be concise, and thank you for your patience. Joe?
I'm a New Yorker born and raised, so I don't know that I can speak briefly, but here's my bullet points. I love the conversation. I want to echo what I think it was Glenn said about these things being universal, but also identity specific at the same time. And I think that's important. And as a white dude, I know that's something I struggle with getting better at all the time, is remembering not to kind of normalize out my experiences and my lens and views. With that, I just want to bullet point one thing real quick. I've struggled a lot, been in the men's engagement work for a couple of decades now. I've struggled a lot with the question of accountability. And I love that there's exponentially more men and boys aware of this stuff and wanting to take action on gender violence, et cetera, for all different motivations. I think it's a both and, not an either or, on a strategic, concrete level of, yeah, we need stuff for folks who are ready to do it for the quote unquote right reasons because it's the right thing to do. Great. Here's what you can do. And for folks who don't think it's a problem or their problem at all, here's how we can get them involved. And I think it's just a range of stuff until we find that silver bullet, if it exists. That said, I think with the exploding number of men and boys interested in these issues and wanting to do something, I think we need to be much more critical about motivation, but also really just accountability and men doing the work individually and internally. And I'm not holding myself up as perfect on that, of course, but I think there's a lot more we need to do about maybe slowing down the process, asking questions about motivation and more as we do the work, because I'm seeing a lot of, and I'm sure others are as well, a lot of stuff replicated, like the pay gap around gender and race being replicated in this work right now that I've seen, and other pieces, including men in this work and other folks, obviously, but men in this work committing violence. I've had a lot of disclosures about people in this work, known names and local names, from women in this work, and I'm told not to tell anyone because they don't want anyone to know, but I know and I'm holding it. So I think we all can do better on that. And for me, it ties into, Charles, your question around motivation a bit, but it's also a bit bigger than that. But that's just one point that I've been struggling with that I wanted to put out there. Thanks. Sorry that was long.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
No worries. Marshall?
Yeah, I'm pretty new to this work, and so I just kind of have a question about the self-interest line of thinking, and maybe it's been answered by Ward and Joe, who both speak very thoughtfully and knowledgeably about these things. I have focused this whole time on just trying to remember my question, and so it's hard for me to also listen, even when I write things down. But my question is, with the self-interest approach, doesn't that sort of enable the privilege of men? And then I think to the point of Charles' article that he sent out, sort of turn into that dominance where men, if they really grasp on this idea of, oh, this would be beneficial to me too, then they would dominate the conversation and the movement and take it away. And so kind of, I don't know if that's a coherent question, but it just seems like the very idea that we have to approach men out of this idea of, look, it's good for you too, is in and of itself enabling privilege. No?
Well, isn't that the doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, the wrong things for the right reason question?
I take a stab at responding to that, Marshall. One of the first things that I very consciously learned to do when I got deeply involved in several feminist organizations was to work on keeping my mouth shut. And it wasn't a terrible process, but it became a way of checking my privilege at the door, in a sense, and necessary to being an active and accepted member of these organizations. So I don't think it's that difficult once you have the objective of doing that. I do agree accountability is very important. But I also had to learn to occasionally be called out and sometimes with considerable vigor and anger about behaviors that I demonstrated and so forth. I needed to get over my own ego hurts about that and so forth. But again, it's something, if you care about it, you can learn to adjust to. Which brings me to several people mentioned privilege stuff. I feel I own to enormous numbers of different types of privileges that I have, but I think you can use those privileges for good ends, and you can do it in an accountable way. I've done this. I've been asked to use my privileges by people, and so it's not like privileges are all bad. It's how you understand them in the greater social structure that there is out there. It's part of reality. There's systems of privilege, and there have been people throughout history who have used their privilege to good ends. It seems to me. It makes things complicated, but I don't think it should stop us.
I think, and we can continue the conversation, but if I can just...
sorry, we're running a little bit late. We need to wrap up. I don't mean to be rude and interrupt you, but as we're wrapping up, the question is, it's about the topics that we want, to have for the next meetup. But